Move in with Frontier Fiber Optic Internet.
Hey, it's us. Your 10 o'clock video conference meeting?
Sorry, I was on mute.
We heard you were moving.
It's time to upgrade to Frontier.
And get upload speeds 25 times faster than cable.
500 meg internet is just $49.99 per month with autopay, plus free activation.
You even get a $100 Visa reward card, too.
So, let's talk next steps.
Do what cable can't. Move in with Frontier.
Go to frontier.com/getmoving for complete offer details. Service is subject to availability and all terms and conditions.
I'm surprised we don't see more coalitions between central city communities with poverty challenges in rural areas.
On this episode of Transition Virginia,
they're bringing balance back to the judiciary.
we preview the upcoming special session.
The Senate always wins, generally, when there's a difference of opinion between the House and the Senate in the budget.
We also take a look at the urban-rural divide in Virginia.
People live in communities, but they work across regions.
We're joined by John Provo at Virginia Tech.
We can put tools at the community level, we can put tools at the regional level, but there's still a lot of important work to be done, big investments that can be made to really address the biggest, scariest problems between urban and rural.
Urban versus rural. $4 billion of stimulus money and 6 new appeals court judges.
What the political leadership of both parties prefer to do when they call a special session is to have everything worked out in advance.
All that and so much more on this episode of Transition Virginia.
G3 Assistance through Virginia's community colleges is your pathway to a new future, helping those who qualify pay for school and train for the right career, right where you are, right now. Learn more at vccs.edu/G3.
Welcome to Transition Virginia, the podcast that examines the ongoing transition of power in Virginia. I'm Michael Pope.
And I'm Thomas Bowman. Today on the podcast, the tension between urban Virginia and rural Virginia. Later in the podcast, we'll hear from John Provo at Virginia Tech about a project they've been working on to explore that urban-rural divide. But before we get to that, Michael, you and I have both been traveling the last month, and with podcast magic, we've managed to only miss a few regular episodes.
Only a few.
Yeah, but we're back now, and we'll resume our normal weekly schedule for anybody who missed us. Michael, what were you up to?
Went to Ocean City to enjoy the beach, some beer, mini golf.
Ocean City, Maryland?
Ocean City, Maryland. Yes, I love Ocean City. It's fun, and so they've got all these classic arcade games. I love playing Galaga. I'm not really a beach person, but I did get some sun, meaning that I'm a slightly less pale shade of white. There's a hint of pink in there, and so. Now, I wouldn't say that I'm tanned, rested, and ready to go, but I'm pinkish, maybe, and rested and ready to go. But it is good to be back. How about yourself?
Well, I had 2 weeks of bouncing between family reunions, and my wife and I managed to sneak a honeymoon in between.
Nice.
Yeah, finally, we got married right at the beginning of the pandemic, and we had to elope instead of having a big party. And so we were supposed to do 2 weeks in Morocco back in April of 2020. Obviously, that didn't happen. And so the first week of our vacation, we went down to Surfside Beach, right below Myrtle Beach in South Carolina, with my mom's side of the family. And that was great. We rented the same house that they've been renting since, the 1970s. And just like you, I have a little Scotch and Irish in me, and not enough that I have red hair or look like it, but I go from pale white reflecto to lobster, just like you. So I avoided getting burnt for the first time probably in my life this year. And then we decided to take 5 days in Asheville, celebrating, I guess, we called it a mini moon. And there's some cool stuff in Asheville. I highly recommend you go. Great food. A lot of Japanese food, actually, Michael. So if you like that, you can't go wrong in Asheville. And a lot of breweries. Wicked Weed was outstanding. And then we went to my dad's house in Charlotte and had Hunter family reunion, and then my aunt's house in Greensboro to have a Bowman family reunion. So that we're all reunioned out. Now we're back 2 weeks later. But I was gone and I was unplugged and it felt nice. So like, Michael, catch me up. What did I miss over these last few weeks?
Well, we're about to head into a special session, a very special session, where lawmakers get to spend more than $4 billion. So it's a huge spending spree that the lawmakers get to spend all this federal stimulus money. And, in advance of leading up into that special session, the governor keeps making these announcements about how he wants to spend chunks of that money. So he made an announcement about spending a lot of it on broadband, for example. He made an announcement about spending some of it for small business development grants. And he's made a number of these kind of announcements.
I saw he proposed to spend around nearly $500 million on improving mental health hospitals.
Yes. So I get the sense every time the governor makes an announcement, what's really going on behind the scenes is that he's cut a deal with Democrat leaders in the House and the Senate. And so if you think about that $4.3 billion as a pie, every time the governor makes an announcement, he's taking a slice out of that pie. And so I think we've already gotten to a point where a majority of that pie has already been taken away. I think about $3 billion. I think if you add up what the governor has announced, it's somewhere around $3 billion. So we're not all the way there yet. So I think in terms of the timing of how long is the special session going to last, in terms of the money part of it, it really comes down to, can the governor and House Democrats and Senate Democrats come to an agreement on how to spend all this money before the gavel comes down? If they can come up with that agreement, we're talking about like a 3-day session, maybe a 4-day session. But if they don't come to an agreement before the special session starts, and the Senate Democrats can't agree with the House Democrats on how to spend this money, I think what we're likely to see happen is like a 3-day session, and then they go into a conference committee. And Thomas, I know you're probably tired of hearing me say this, but I'm going to describe this conference committee as a secret, closed door, not open to the public, not open to the press conference committee where they make all these decisions in secret. This goes back to our first episode when I complained about this on the very first episode of Transition Virginia. And I will continue complaining about this secret closed door conference committee. So yeah, I mean, in terms of the timeline of this thing, either it's a 3-day session and they in which case they have already made an agreement before the gavel comes down, or it's a 3 days of floor sessions, and then they go into like a conference committee where they try to resolve the differences between the House Democrats and the Senate Democrats. What's your suspicion on whether or not House Democrats and Senate Democrats can find some sort of common ground with each other before the special session starts?
Well, from what you described, Michael, it actually sounds like a much more normal special session compared to, if you recall, last year, that COVID session, which dragged on and on and on, weeks, became months, I believe, until they finally gavelled out. So what the political leadership of both parties prefer to do when they call a special session is to have everything worked out in advance, because they're not getting compensated as much to do these special sessions compared to a regular session. And because Virginia is a part-time legislature, they all need to go back to their day jobs, those who have day jobs. And so it makes a lot of sense from the leadership perspective that they would want all the trains to move on time and everything goes smoothly, and to have this back and forth already kind of like stage managed, more or less. But to your question as to the House versus the Senate, I understand that, Michael, nobody who isn't on one of the money committees is going to be able to make amendments. Like, fill me in on that.
Yeah, there's lots of hurt feelings about this among Democrats and Republicans. So if you're not on one of the money committees, you're kind of shut out of this process, and you're not allowed to make amendments the way you would in a normal budget process. This process is going to be expedited in a way to make it run fast, and making it run fast means they're not really hearing amendments. And so the Republican solution to that is they say they're going to offer floor amendments. But, by the time it gets to the floor, it's the 11th hour, and, things have kind of already been worked out, and you can make a show out of it, but your floor amendment's probably not going to go anywhere. So I would expect to see the Republicans not happy about the fact they could not make amendments, and instead make some floor amendments and speeches about how they were cut out of the process. In fact, I can almost guarantee that's going to happen. There are also Democrats who are unhappy with the fact that they can't make amendments either. I don't think you'll see them stand up on the floor and make speeches, but they have been sending me angry text messages anonymously.
I heard, not anonymously, I should say, that your member was particularly upset. I think I saw that on Twitter. Your delegate, Mark Levine, is particularly upset that he can't make amendments other than floor ones.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Democratic leadership in the House and the Senate have made the conclusion that they want to expedite this thing. And so their logic is, look, people are hurting. We're in the midst of a crisis, and Virginia needs to spend all this federal stimulus money as quickly as possible to get it in the hands of people who need it. And in order to expedite that and make it run as fast as possible, they're cutting out the amendment process. And so, yeah, a lot of people are upset about that, but that's the way it's going to work for this special session. And, it's not just federal stimulus money. There's another part of the special session that hasn't received as much attention, but they will also be appointing a whole bunch of new appeals court judges. So earlier this year, the General Assembly took an action to expand the jurisdiction of the Virginia Court of Appeals, because most people don't know this, but Thomas, Virginia is the only state in the country where you're not guaranteed a right to appeal your case. Some cases might be appealed, but then some other cases might never be appealed at all. And that means if the judge in your case made a mistake or was corrupt or had a bad decision, or, your case was flawed for some reason, you don't have a right to an appeal. And so the General Assembly decided that they wanted to expand the jurisdiction of the Court of Appeals so everybody is guaranteed the right to appeal. In order to do that, they created 6 new positions on the appeals court that did not previously exist. So one of the things they're going to do with the special session is fill these brand new positions. Now, normally when the General Assembly elects judges, they're filling, vacancies.
Right.
This is different because they're filling brand new positions that had not previously existed. Meanwhile, they also happen to have 2 vacancies on the appeals court that they will also be filling. One has been vacant for quite some time. It's the Rossi Alston seat. And then there's another appeals court judge that's going to retire later this year. So they'll actually will be appointing 8 appeals court judges, 6 new positions and 2 vacancies. So I would expect to see lots of drama on that because Republicans feel like Democrats are packing the court here and filling it up with people who are sympathetic to defense lawyers. And so I would imagine we will also be hearing some speeches from Republicans about that. But this is one of those things where, when you're in the minority, you can shine a spotlight on things and bring public attention to it. But, clearly they don't have the votes to stop any of these judges. But I would expect some drama about who's being appointed to these positions.
Yeah, and I guess I'm not surprised to hear that Republicans would frame this as packing the court rather than what the Democrats want to frame it as, and I think rightly so, which is making sure everybody gets their due process in a state where I guess we're the only one where people couldn't have their due process and appealing it. But, I would push back against that framing. And the reason I'd push back against it is because after 27 years of Republican control, and the party, notoriously, I'm not breaking any news here, the party notoriously fixates on the judicial bench as a way to get favorable rulings or to bat things down that they don't like in a format where they wouldn't necessarily be able to pass it through the legislature because maybe an unfavorable executive or they don't have enough votes in the ledge. And so I would push back against the Republican claim of court packing to say that the courts are already packed. And it's salient. It's a point that'll definitely cut through to a lot of people who aren't really paying attention or haven't been. In fact, if you recall, FDR tried to pack the Supreme Court. And even though he had all the power in the world at the time, that's the one thing he couldn't do because it put too many people off, right? So we know that this is going to be an effective claim from the Republicans, at least in theory. But again, I would frame it as the courts are already packed in a way. And so what the Democrats are really doing, in addition to, making sure that the residents of Virginia get their due process and ability to appeal, is they're bringing balance back to the judiciary for the first time in 30 years. And if you recall, it's really longer than that, because the Democratic Party of 30 years ago is nothing like the Democratic Party of today.
Yeah, you bring up the FDR court packing plan, which of course he was not able to get through. And I think, there's lots of ways this circumstance is totally different,
right,
from what happened with FDR. But there also is a little bit of a similarity, which is when FDR wanted to add multiple judges to the U.S. Supreme Court, it was changing the composition of the court. So it was multiple judges being appointed all at the same time, with the expectation that that would change the composition of the court. So what's happening now is multiple judges are being elected, and the Democrats are not saying they want to change the composition of the judiciary, but Republicans are saying, look, that's what's going to happen. And so, there are many ways that what's happening now has nothing at all to do with the FDR court packing plan. But I think there is that little nugget of similarity there.
Yeah, I think it sticks out in people's brains, right? And so this is something that will likely come back up as we get closer to November, accusations of Democrats packing the court, because the average person doesn't want any party to pack the court with presumably their ideologues. And of course, it's important to understand that's not at all what's happening here. And we desperately need judicial reform. We've got a bunch of people sitting on the bench that just do not identify with the people that they are judging at all, like through life circumstances, through economic circumstances. And that makes them not good people to have on the bench, frankly. And I'm speaking with a very broad brush, and I don't mean to insult the whole judiciary, because that's not what I'm trying to do. What I'm trying to say is that we need more balance, and we need more appellate judges that think differently from the cut and dry model from the last 30 years.
Well, to that end, Thomas, there's another piece of this which is really interesting. The current makeup of the existing appeals court judges, there are 11 of them. It's not a very diverse and balanced group. And what I mean by that is, if you look at geographic balance, there's nobody on the Court of Appeals who lives west of Richmond. There's one person who's from Winchester, but that's the only Northern Virginia judge. That's the only Northern Virginia judge. There's this one person from Winchester on the Court of Appeals. So there are Democrats who said, look, this is an opportunity to create some geographic balance on the Court of Appeals by making sure you got people from Southwest Virginia, and also, hey, make sure you get people from Northern Virginia, which is the population center of the Commonwealth. Also, not a lot of racial balance or women on the court. This is also a really good opportunity to add some more women to the court and add some more minorities to the court. And even Republicans will say, yes, we need to make sure that the court has a balance of women and minorities. So I think we can expect to see these 6 new positions and 2 filled vacancies to create some new regional balance from Southwest Virginia and Northern Virginia, and also add some women and minority judges to the appeals court.
Well, this is a good segue to bring us back to that timeline question that you asked me about what I thought between the House and the Senate, or how long things would take. Traditionally, in a normal session, discussion of judicial appointments and the floor fight that you have over it can take an entire day or 2 days, and sometimes longer than that in a particularly contentious year. So if they're thinking they can do this Monday through Wednesday or Thursday, I would, just for the legislative allocation of the federal stimulus, I would tack on at least a day, maybe 2, for judicial appointments. And that's before you have the potential for conference committee, which takes as long as it needs to take.
Yeah, and then there's also the wild card here of the minority, in this case the Republicans, doing all of everything that they can in terms of parliamentary tricks to extend the length of this thing.
Yes.
They can insist on the first reading, they can insist on the second reading, they can insist on the reading of the calendar. And so if they want to play that game, they can really drag this thing out for a very long period of time. They will be away from their day jobs and not making money. So I'm not really sure they want to go down that road, but they could if they wanted to.
Well, and if they were to go down that road, it would be in line with the national strategy, which is just drag things out. I mean, inflict pain isn't really necessarily the right way to phrase it, but that's, inflict pain, I guess, is the best way you can. And to make it so everybody just wants to get out of there. Because when you get that dynamic going, people aren't paying attention to the policy as much. They just want to go home.
Yeah, there are a group of Republicans in Congress who have recently been doing all kinds of parliamentary things to make everything go slower. So, for example, if there's a bill that everybody agrees to and part of their floor session where they just sort of unanimously consent to something like, the naming of a post office or something that's not at all controversial, there is this group of Republicans that have been systematically insisting on recorded votes for every single bill, no matter what it's about. And that actually does gum up the process and make things go slower. There is a critical distinction there because those Republicans in Washington, that's their full-time job. Like, they're in Washington and being a member of Congress is their full-time job. These Republicans in the General Assembly, they got to get back to their law office and make money.
Right. Yeah. So it'll be interesting. I would say I wouldn't be surprised either way. So I think 3 or 4 days is probably a little too optimistic because there's too many Democrats who are going to be upset about being cut out of the process. And one thing I know about the speaker is she likes to make sure everybody gets to have their say or weigh in. She is a consensus builder, and she likes to have consensus, at least among her caucus members, before she moves forward with something. And so that a lot of people like that, and a lot of people who want to move more quickly get frustrated by that. And I wouldn't really ascribe a positive or negative connotation to that. It's just that's the way she likes to do business. And so planning for that, anticipating a budget difference, the Senate always wins generally when there's a difference of opinion between the House and the Senate in the budget. So that could either go quickly or it could take a long time. It just depends on how much communication Delegate Torian and Senator Howell, the two money committee chairs, have had and how coordinated their efforts are. And so I'm glad to hear that the governor is pre-scripting as much of these agreements as possible. So there's less to haggle over and fight over. And, that should move things along. But I still say, I would be surprised if it took 2 weeks, and certainly much more surprised if it took longer than that. But I would say anywhere between 5 business days to 2 weeks, somewhere in that line is what I would expect.
Well, you mentioned communication. We have been getting some communication about our podcast. And so we have voicemail, Thomas, from one of our listeners who wants to comment about a recent episode.
Hey, Tommy Bowman. How's it going, brother? Haven't heard from you in a little while. Listen, was looking through some episodes of the podcast. Saw you did one on the mace. Amazing, amazing. Can't believe you didn't have me on. Absolutely unacceptable. You did an episode about the House of Delegates mace. You didn't have me on. Pennsylvania has a mace. We got 2. Got 2 maces. Yeah? He brought up South Carolina's sword. Yeah? Yeah, great. South Carolina has a sword. Nobody cares. Can't believe you didn't have me on. Pathetic.
That was, of course, the voice of Transition Virginia fan favorite Trevor Sutherland, who has not been on the podcast in a few episodes, and we need to have him back on. I didn't realize he was an expert on the mace, or the maces, plural, that they've got up there in Pennsylvania, but clearly he's got something to say about it.
Well, that's our mistake, Trevor. And, the reason that we didn't invite you on to talk about the mace is because we don't really want to hear what Pennsylvanians have to say about their mace. For anybody who doesn't know, Trevor has moved on to greener pastures, and he is now helping out the House Dems in Pennsylvania. So good for Trevor. As far as he's concerned, it's definitely a promotion, and he can just stay there with his thoughts and opinions about Pennsylvania's 2 maces, because that's redundant. We don't need that. We have the House of Delegates. They're more important than the Senate, in my opinion. Fighting words for the Senate, but it's just true because we're older in the House. I was a House staffer, so I'm somewhat biased, but the House is older. The House and Virginia comes first. And so our mace here in Virginia is just naturally better, Trevor. So, you can keep those opinions on your side of the Potomac, and we'll keep ours down here, right? So we'll just fall into some old habits. But thank you for playing that, Michael. I'm glad, and I see I go away for 2 weeks, and we've changed up everything about Transition Virginia. So
if you want to send us a voicemail, it's really easy to do. On your smartphone, there is a voice recording app. Just record any kind of reaction you have to any of our episodes and send it to us. We might play it on the air.
All right. Well, when we come back, we're going to hear from John Provo at Virginia Tech about their ongoing project to unpack the differences between urban Virginia and rural Virginia. That includes a book that'll be out this fall called Vibrant Virginia. And it also includes a bunch of panel discussions, including one that was moderated by Michael Pope. So more on that when we come back.
Move in with Frontier Fiber Optic Internet.
Hey, it's us. Your 10 o'clock video conference meeting?
Sorry, I was on mute.
We heard you were moving.
It's time to upgrade to Frontier.
And get upload speeds 25 times faster than cable.
500 meg internet is just $49.99 per month with autopay, plus free activation.
You even get a $100 Visa reward card, too.
So, let's talk next steps.
Do what cable can't. Move in with Frontier.
Go to frontier.com/getmoving for complete offer details. Services subject to availability and all terms and conditions. Move in with Frontier Fiber Optic Internet.
Hey, it's us. Your 10 o'clock video conference meeting?
Sorry, I was on mute.
We heard you were moving.
It's time to upgrade to Frontier.
And get upload speeds 25 times faster than cable.
500 meg internet is just $49.99 per month with autopay, plus free activation.
You even get a $100 Visa reward card, too.
So, let's talk next steps.
Do what cable can't. Move in with Frontier.
Go to frontier.com/getmoving for complete offer details. Services subject to availability and all terms and conditions.
Hey, you. Yes, you. You're listening to Transition Virginia right now, and you're probably a fan of the podcast, right? Well, then rate and review, like Trevor Sutherland.
1 star. The only time I listen is when I'm on.
That's not really what I was thinking. Well, how about this review from Richard Krause?
This piece of shit podcast, I wouldn't even rate 1 star.
Come on, listeners. I know you can do better than that. Hit the pause button right now and give us a quick review. And we're back on Transition Virginia. We're joined by the director of the Center for Economic and Community Engagement at Virginia Tech, John Provo. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Good to be here.
It's great to have you. And the folks at Virginia Tech have this project called Vibrant Virginia that is seeking to understand the urban-rural divide in Virginia. It's an ongoing project that has a lot of different pieces to it. Tell our listeners about Vibrant Virginia and what you're hoping to accomplish.
Well, thanks. Sure. There's 2 big things and a lot of little parts, right? So the 2 big things are really unpacking urban and rural, helping us better understand connections and disconnections, helping us better understand what we're even saying when we talk about urban and rural and all the places in between, and think about what we are doing right or what we could do differently to improve outcomes and opportunity in a policy space or in other ways. We're also really working to better engage and create more essentially easy buttons for folks to engage with higher ed, to pursue positive change in their communities, whether urban, rural, or anything in between.
So you mentioned that one of the aims of this project was to unpack urban and rural and get a sense of like, what are we actually talking about when we use those words? One of the people involved in this project made a point that I thought was really salient, which is that the urban-rural divide in Virginia actually works differently than it does in most states because Virginia doesn't have any large mega cities. So like if you think about Maryland has Baltimore. So the urban-rural divide in Maryland is between this huge city, Baltimore, and rural Maryland. So there's a huge urban rural divide in Maryland. But in Virginia, there are no large cities. So does that change the dynamics of what we're talking about in terms of the urban rural divide in Virginia?
Well, I think it actually maybe highlights what's most interesting to me about this is that, urban and rural are really defined by where you sit in some ways. There's as many definitions for that in a researcher's line of work as you want to find. But if you think about, I used to think about explaining to faculty in our Northern Virginia campus locations what it was like to come to rural Virginia and the difference between bringing someone from Arlington down to Blacksburg and taking someone from Arlington, where they may think they've made a big trip to the country coming to Blacksburg, but then say bringing a partner from Lee County up to visit our campus in Blacksburg, they're coming to a much more developed and urbanized area, even if it doesn't, feel particularly urban to someone from the greater Washington area, let's say. So really, for me, a lot of what I'm looking for is understanding how people perceive that density, how that impacts what they do in their industry or what happens in a certain area of social policy. And yes, the lack of a big mega city versus the countryside maybe changes our politics a little bit. But certainly the Nova-Rova distinctions come into play as we think about as you've talked about, what's going on in transitions around Capitol Square and Richmond and such. But from a researcher's point of view, I do think it just sort of changes some of the framing and really highlights for me that, it's all about relative density.
That is a great point. And I find it fascinating because I used to live in Northern Virginia and I'm from Fairfax and at the time was living in Arlington. And when I was a staffer for the General Assembly, so, you come down to Richmond for session, all of the rural delegation comes to Richmond and many of the members or staffers will act like it's their first time in the big city, and that influenced their behavior. Is that common that you found?
The sort of a fish out of water phenomenon, I guess.
Yeah.
I think everybody makes a mental map around their daily living, right? Whether it's about your commute, where you get your coffee, where you go to recreate. And when you pull yourself out of your regular day-to-day setting, you've got to rebuild your map. And I think that's kind of what we're talking about here because, the shape of our economy has changed since, I grew up actually in Fredericksburg, which used to be this little town in between Richmond and Northern Virginia and is now definitely, part of the urban crescent, if folks in the eastern part of the state still refer to it as such. And I think that, the context for what makes sense in the economy and society and whatever is very different than that town I grew up in. And you can have that same kind of conversation anywhere. But what we still have city and county boundaries, and we still have policies, that were created for a very different Virginia. And it's something we need to think about. And we need to think about how to, what's our demographics and how does it look in the landscape? I mean, there was a big excitement over the last year about proposed redefinitions of what it meant to be a metropolitan area, which, not to muddy us even further, but is, essentially a collection of communities typically linked by commuting patterns and economic interactions. And, there was an idea about sort of raising the threshold for that because, population's gone up. So that's pretty simple. But, there was a lot of hue and cry with what would the impact of that be? And people really couldn't begin to sort through all of that because these definitions about metropolitan, about urban and rural, they're embedded, not just in our cultural practices, but also embedded in all sorts of different policy definitions, agency rules, and things that we need to do a little bit of work to unpack if we want to see them operating better.
Well, so let's continue to unpack this thing. One of the people involved in this project is Liz Povar at the Riverlink Group. She helped provide some guidance on some of the chapters, and she participated in a panel discussion where she made an interesting point about the history of economic development statistics in Virginia. She says the strong statewide numbers obscured the weakness of rural Virginia. Essentially, she's saying here that the urban numbers were really, really good and really, really big, and that had the effect of hiding the fact that the rural numbers were horrible. Here's Liz Povar of the Riverlink Group in one of the Vibrant Virginia panel discussions.
The mantle of taking control of your own communities is now in the hands of regional and local leaders much more visibly than it historically has been. And the numbers that are reported based on job creation, capital investment, those numbers are now available regionally, which helps us all think about where do we have to have some different solutions for different parts of Virginia.
So how is this urban-rural dynamic changing? She's making the point here that the previous way of collecting these statistics actually obscured what was really going on, but now we have better data because it's regional. So how is this dynamic changing?
Well, I think one of the things that is really important, and Stephen Murray, who also contributed a chapter to the book, has been talking about this since he came to Virginia, is really looking at growing prosperity on a regional basis, right? Is recognizing that people live in communities, but they work across regions. So understanding, employment change, marketing, investment opportunities, and finding a way to share progress across communities is really the critical work of, that Liz was kind of referring to. So, we do have different ways that we collect and present data. And we also have new organizations. Something we have now that we didn't have at the start of my career is this program called Go Virginia, Growth Opportunity Virginia. And essentially going back to the 2016-17 session, we've had this essentially handing off of, not just planning and, sorry, I'm missing this. So we've had this handing off of not just responsibility for planning about economic development to the regions, but we've also given some money that previously might have just been doled out from Richmond out to regional bodies that have the authority to make investments on their own. In years past, we had things like this in the most distressed areas, say like in the Tobacco Commission footprint. But now regions in all parts of Virginia have this catalytic funding tool. It's not the be-all and end-all of everything. And full disclosure, my office is actually involved in supporting one of these, staffing one of these groups in the Blacksburg, Roanoke, Lynchburg area. But it's a tool, and it's a way to think about where we place these tools, right? So doing these things regionally, I think, is only going to become more and more important.
All right, so we're hearing about the weakness of economic development across rural Virginia and the strength of economic development in urban Virginia. But there's another participant of Vibrant Virginia who says that doesn't mean we should jump to conclusions. Conway Haskins at the Center for Innovative Technology says a closer look at the numbers reveals some important problems in urban Virginia.
5 or 6 of the top cities in the country with the highest eviction rates in the United States are in Virginia, right? And those are in those cities. Not that the issues aren't happening in the counties, but they're happening in our cities. But if we just talk about urban being so prosperous, so we're missing the fact that there are a ton of people that are struggling.
So is this urban-rural divide something more complicated than just urban areas are doing great and rural areas are struggling?
I think we need to be thinking about this in very nuanced terms, very granular terms. So it's definitely more complicated than just urban and rural. We've got a host of areas that are kind of in between, sort of small metro areas that don't fit the typical perception of urban and rural, depending on where you sit. And we've got both challenges and opportunities in all of these places. And if we can better define and grapple with what it is we're trying to say when we call a place urban or rural or suburban, we can give those communities and the collections of communities in each region, more tools to be able to do the right thing for their folks. And part of this, if we recognize that we're not just talking about urban and rural, we're talking about what connects us, what are the disconnects, and what are the connections and disconnections within our communities. And I'm sometimes surprised that we don't see more. And, maybe this is a thing that'll grow in future General Assembly sessions as our politics continue to evolve. But I'm surprised we don't see more coalitions between central city communities with poverty challenges in rural areas. And maybe part of that is the information and the data to help them see similarities in their challenges really isn't easy to access and discuss.
This makes a lot of sense because working for the member who represented Mount Vernon, for example, he had in his district some of the richest zip codes in America, richer than Beverly Hills, right next to some of the poorest zip codes in America. And so it really strikes me as a function of class, right? So the number one indicator of economic success is really how easy is it to move up from a lower class to a middle class or a middle class to a higher class. And so is anybody thinking about bridging the urban-rural divide as a way via increasing class mobility?
Well, I think one of the interesting things when you talk about economic and community development policies is sort of sifting and sorting through things that affect people and things that affect places and things that affect people in places, right? So, yeah, I think that's a totally open area of discussion. And I think you'll get economic arguments about when different types of policies can affect that. There's certainly a national overlay about challenges in upward mobility in the current, structure of the economy. And I think we're seeing folks look at the Great Reset as we come back from the pandemic shutdowns and think about what this means. And are we losing certain types of jobs and gaining other types? And what's the impact on people and places? And how do we responsibly resolve that? We've talked about regions finding common cause and getting more tools. We've talked about helping communities see what they're maybe missing in the shadow of prosperity. Or, you could also flip this around. There's great economic opportunity in people making something of it in our most rural distressed communities too, but it's often obscured by great amounts of poverty.
Okay, so we've saved the juiciest part of the debate for the end here. The chapter on broadband is a barn burner. Virginia Tech professor emeritus James Bolin argues that community and municipal broadband in Virginia has been blocked by a powerful coalition of legacy telecom companies and cable providers. Now, he's talking about Cox, Comcast, CenturyLink, Verizon, AT&T. He's making the point that these companies have used their power and their influence and their campaign contributions and their relationship with lawmakers to stifle the competition and benefit themselves at the expense of others. Here's Professor Bolin.
Right now, Virginia is one of just 14 states that block municipal broadbands, and that some of the innovative work in internet broadband development is going on at the municipal level. And as a consequence, many of the communities within Virginia are being slighted by their inability to easily establish broadband systems within their own municipalities.
Now, his chapter points out that the telecom companies and the cable providers have worked with lawmakers to rig the system, preventing local governments from subsidizing development of broadband infrastructure. They're also not allowed to set prices lower than the incumbent providers. But in one of the panel discussions for Vibrant Virginia, the governor's broadband advisor, Evan Feynman, says he rejects the idea that that coalition is blocking progress.
An urban network is the strongest use case for a municipal network. Out in rural areas, the inability to enjoy the economies of scale that large-scale network owners and operators already have means that you undertake a great deal more risk and you have a lot more in the way of fixed costs if you stand up, 1, 2, 30, 40 different county networks.
So he's saying that anyone who thought that community broadband or municipal broadband was the answer for rural Virginia's broadband problems doesn't fully understand the economics of the situation. John Provo, what do we make of this really interesting debate here about the past of what's happened with this broadband discussion and also the future of where this thing is headed now?
Well, Michael, I think this really is an interesting opportunity to think more broadly about how we resolve all of what we've talked about here today, right? Because they were talking about differences between communities. They were talking about issues of density and how that impacts a policy choice. The governor recently proposed spending, and the legislature in a short period of time will get the chance to consider investing a tremendous amount of money from the Federal Recovery Act, Rescue Act in broadband, which is a big central government commitment to resolving a problem that spreads across all these different levels. And if you think about it, it's one of our challenges in this topic has been sort of, who owns what kind of issues as times change, as communities develop in different ways and grow or decline. Who really owns the issues when the new technology comes along? And I'm talking about the broad sweep of history here, right? And central responsibility, if you think about it, I mean, counties and cities are creatures of the state that are created by the state government to better administer things for the public good. All the sorts of regional bodies and programs we've talked about are of that sort. So I guess what I'm ultimately saying is that some of these policy answers that crop up where urban and rural differences are particularly sharp, we can put tools at the community level, we can put tools at the regional level, but there's still a lot of important work to be done, big investments that can be made to really address the biggest, hairiest problems between urban and rural.
It strikes me that this binary discussion about economics really misses the point. Access to internet should be a public utility, and we already have an economic model that makes a lot of sense for the case of rural broadband, where you would create a public service corporation, you would take on the initial costs of installation in the areas where a privatized company couldn't really recoup their money, and then you would bill it like electricity rates. We already have this model ready-made.
Well, there are examples certainly around Virginia and in other states where like co-ops like Citizens and Floyd have taken that on and become really interesting contributors, not just to their community, but also to surrounding communities. And I think it's clearly been a piece of how we deliver solutions. But I think maybe the larger point for me is that we can solve a lot of things at the local level, but ultimately that doesn't get the state off the hook for being a constructive participant, whether it's in authorizing different models and experiments or resourcing larger solutions like they're proposing to do now on this broadband issue.
So we're coming toward the end of our time. I want to get a sense of what's next for Vibrant Virginia. So you got this book that's coming out this fall. Everybody's excited to get their copy of the book. What happens after that? Where's Vibrant Virginia headed in the future?
Well, thanks. The book, and I'll share a link you can share with your listeners. But for book notifications, that is going to come out this fall. And we're very happy to offer that up as a starting point for some discussions that we hope we'll have between our university and communities, we'll have between folks in policy roles in communities and government folks. And we're going to go on the road as soon as that's safe and appropriate. And we hope to take the book as a jumping off point for meetings in different parts of the state. We're doing some things within Virginia Tech. We've actually created a Vibrant Virginia Council, and we've put together some strategic funds that we're going to use to support university community partnerships. When I get off the phone with you here, I'm going to be working through about 30 proposed faculty projects in everything from health and aging to technical assistance for companies and other sorts of community and talent development kind of projects. And so we're just happy to keep the conversation going and looking for ways to make it both an academic but also a practical exercise as well.
So that's all for this episode.
Support us on Patreon or send us an email to transitionvapodcast@gmail.com.
Like and follow at TransitionVA on Twitter and anywhere pods are cast.
Read the transcripts at transitionvirginia.com, and special thanks to Emily Cottrell for figuring out what the heck we're saying.
Thanks for being on the transition team. We're your hosts, Thomas Bowman.
And I'm Michael Pope.
Buying a home can feel like navigating uncharted waters. Redfin agents can help. They'll answer your questions with honest advice so you know exactly what you're getting into. They'll also help you tour as many homes as you want and show you what it takes to make a winning offer. With a Redfin agent on your side, you can sail straight to your dream home. Local expertise from Redfin. That's real estate done right. Tour subject to property and agent availability. Virginia Office Falls Church, VA, 844-759-7732.
Is it time for a new heating and cooling system? Turn to the experts at Griffith Energy Services and Carrier today and get 0% financing for 18 months on a new heating and cooling system. Get the comfort you deserve from Griffith Energy Services and Carrier. Visit griffithenergyservices.com today for this and other exclusive offers. That's griffithenergyservices.com. License number MDHVACR 01-2278.
Griffith Energy Services. Doggone dependable.